The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, the air thick with anticipation. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, unwavering, her eyes locked on Judge Stephen Adams, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was only matched by the quiet whispers of corruption that trailed behind him. This was no ordinary hearing. This was the kind of case that could shake the very foundation of the justice system, a government ethics scandal that reached into the highest levels of power, one that threatened to expose an intricate web of deceit. But as Bondi presented her case, Adams made it clear he was not going to let her win. With every ruling, every interruption, every veiled insult, he worked to derail her. And yet Bondi was no stranger to pressure. She had come prepared, and what she was about to reveal would send shockwaves through the room. The real question was, how far would Adams go to stop her? A hush fell over the courtroom as Bondi strode confidently toward the prosecution's table, setting down her thick file of evidence with a resounding thud. Across the room, Judge Adams leaned back in his chair, his expression betraying something beyond judicial impartiality, contempt, perhaps even disdain. His gavel had already come down hard, shutting down her previous motions with a thinly veiled smirk. But Bondi wasn't rattled, not yet. This case had started with a simple tip, a nameless source slipping an envelope into her office mailbox. Inside were documents detailing illegal government contracts that funneled millions into shell corporations linked to high-ranking officials. But the deeper she dug, the more tangled the corruption became, leading straight to the very man presiding over this hearing. Adams wasn't just another corrupt judge. He was a gatekeeper, ensuring that powerful figures stayed untouchable. And now he was ensuring that she didn't get the chance to expose the truth. From the moment proceedings began, Adams wielded his authority like a weapon. Every objection from the defense was sustained without hesitation. Every piece of evidence Bondi introduced was met with scrutiny, delay, or outright dismissal. His voice dripped with condescension, each ruling punctuated with a smirk, as if he were daring her to challenge him. The courtroom, filled with reporters and government officials, hung on to every word, watching the duel unfold. Then came the moment that made Bondi's blood turn cold. Adams leaned forward, his voice lower, controlled, but cutting. His words were not just dismissive, they were personal. A direct insult aimed at undermining her credibility, her competence, her right to even be in this room. The insult sent murmurs through the crowd, reporters scribbling furiously. But Bondi didn't flinch. If anything, the attack sharpened her resolve. She met his gaze, holding it just long enough for the weight of his words to settle between them like a silent challenge. This was more than a legal battle. This was war. She turned to her first witness, a former government contractor whose testimony could unravel the first layer of the corruption. But just as he was about to speak, Adams cut in, questioning his credibility before he could utter a single damning word. The defense attorney, smug and unbothered, sat back as Adams essentially did his work for him. Bondi adjusted her approach, pivoting to another piece of evidence, financial records that pointed directly to the siphoning of public funds. Again, Adams found a technicality, a flimsy excuse to render it inadmissible. He was playing a dangerous game, testing how much control he truly had over this courtroom. But what he didn't realize was that Bondi had anticipated this. Every roadblock, every dismissive remark, every time he tightened his grip, he was exposing himself. The jury was watching, the press was watching, and somewhere in that crowd, someone else was watching too, someone who had handed her that envelope weeks ago, someone who knew more than they had let on. As the hearing dragged on, the weight of Adams's bias became undeniable. He wasn't just obstructing justice, he was protecting something or someone, and the more he fought to suppress the evidence, the clearer it became that he was afraid. Bondi took a slow, deliberate breath. If Adams thought he could control the outcome of this case, he was mistaken. She reached into her briefcase, fingers brushing against something smooth and cold, a single USB drive tucked away beneath stacks of paper. It was her ace, her final move, and when she played it, the entire courtroom would never see Adams the same way again, but she wouldn't use it. Not yet. Instead, she let a small, knowing smile cross her lips before turning back to the witness stand. Let Adams believe he was winning. Let him think he had buried this case in legal technicalities and intimidation, because when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just ruin him, it would destroy everything he had spent his career protecting. And in this courtroom, the fall of a man like Adams would be more than a legal victory. It would be justice. But justice was never easy, not when it threatened those who thrived in the shadows. Judge Adams adjusted his robe, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom as though he had already secured his victory. He had silenced her first witness, buried her evidence in technicalities, and twisted the rules in ways only a man with unchecked power could. But Bondi had seen men like him before, men who thought their robes or titles made them untouchable. She turned her attention back to the courtroom, catching the subtle shift in the jury's expressions. Adams had overplayed his hand. The arrogance, the blatant bias, it wasn't lost on them. A spark of doubt flickered in their eyes, and doubt was dangerous. It was the crack in a foundation that could bring the whole structure crumbling down. Still, Adams wasn't done. He leaned forward again, his voice thick with condescension as he spoke, tearing into her credentials, belittling her legal strategy, and painting her as reckless, desperate, even incompetent. The defense attorney watched with quiet amusement, knowing he didn't have to do much when the judge was willing to fight his battles for him. Bondi let the words settle, let the courtroom absorb the venom laced in every syllable. Then, calmly, she lifted her eyes, locking onto Adams with a patience that unnerved him. She wasn't fighting his insults. She was letting him talk, because every word, every sneer, every blatant manipulation was weaving its own damning narrative, not hers, his. Slowly, she walked toward the table, her fingers trailing over the edge of the wood as she pulled out another set of documents. This time, she wouldn't let Adams control the rhythm of the case. She placed the papers down deliberately, knowing full well the judge was already preparing another dismissal. But this wasn't just evidence, it was a challenge. A single breath of hesitation from him would be noticed, and he knew it. The document outlined a crucial detail, a signature on a government contract, approving funds that had mysteriously vanished into thin air. A signature belonging to someone close to Adams. He didn't flinch, but something flickered in his expression. Still, he pressed forward, dismissing the document before she could even finish presenting it, waving it away with a scoff, an almost theatrical display of disdain. But his performance had begun to crack. Bondi didn't push back immediately. She let silence stretch between them, heavy and deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable, eyes darting between her and Adams, waiting to see who would make the next move. And then she spoke. Her words were measured, calculated. A simple observation spoken so calmly it sent a ripple through the room. Adams had dismissed the document a little too quickly, a little too forcefully, almost as if he already knew what it contained. A beat of silence, a shift in the air. For the first time, Adams hesitated. Bondi pressed forward, her voice steady, unwavering. She wasn't just talking to Adams anymore. She was talking to the jury, the spectators, the reporters, scribbling furiously in the back rows. She painted the picture clearly, outlining the network of corruption tied to this contract, the missing funds, and the careful orchestration that ensured no one could be held accountable. And then the final stroke. A name. A direct connection between the approved funds and a private offshore. Account tied to none other than Adams's longtime legal associate. A murmur rippled through the room. Even the defense attorney stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening around his pen. Adams' jaw clenched. Bondi could feel it now, his grip slipping. He slammed his gavel down, his voice sharp, accusing her of overreaching, of turning the courtroom into a spectacle. His words were loud, furious, but they didn't have the same weight anymore, because the courtroom had seen something in that moment. A flicker of something beneath his carefully composed mask. Fear. Bondi took a step back, allowing the tension to settle before she continued. The more Adams fought, the more he revealed. And she wasn't done yet. She motioned for her next witness to take the stand. A financial analyst who had traced the missing money through a labyrinth of accounts, a man with nothing to gain by testifying, except perhaps a clear conscience. But before he could even begin, Adams interrupted. Not a simple objection. A complete, total shutdown. A ruling that the testimony would not be permitted on the grounds that it was irrelevant, that it lacked sufficient foundation, that it was, according to him, a waste of the court's time. The courtroom was stunned. This wasn't just judicial overreach. This was desperation. And Bondi saw it for what it was. Adams wasn't just biased. He was actively protecting someone, and she had just gotten too close. A slow, creeping realization spread through the courtroom. The tension was no longer just between Bondi and Adams. It had shifted. The jury was watching him now. The press was scribbling faster. Even the defense attorney seemed to be weighing his next move carefully, as though realizing that whatever power had been shielding his client was no longer as impenetrable as he had believed. Bondi exhaled slowly, letting her fingers drift toward her briefcase. The USB drive was still there waiting. She wasn't going to use it. Not yet. There was still more to be uncovered, and Adams was going to reveal it himself. Because the thing about corruption, the moment it starts unraveling, it doesn't stop, and she was going to pull that thread until the whole thing collapsed around him. The problem with men like Judge Stephen Adams was that they believed in their own invincibility, that the weight of their power, their title, their influence would always be enough to crush opposition. And for years, maybe it had been. Maybe that gavel had been enough to silence the people who dared stand against him. But not today. Pam Bondi kept her stance firm, her expression unreadable, but inside she could feel it. The shift, the unraveling. Adams had made a mistake. Several, actually. But his biggest one was underestimating the power of scrutiny. The courtroom wasn't blind. They had seen how quickly he had moved to silence the financial analyst, how aggressively he had shut down her attempts to introduce key evidence. And now he was on the defensive. He might have been sitting higher than her, towering from his seat behind the bench, but power wasn't in titles. It was in control, and Bondi was the one controlling the momentum now. She moved with careful precision, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Adams uncomfortable. A good prosecutor knew when to press and when to let the tension do the work for them, and it was working. A bead of sweat had formed near Adams's temple. His jaw was set, his fingers curled too tightly around the armrests of his chair. She had seen this before, the way men reacted when the walls they had so carefully constructed started closing in. She turned toward the jury, toward the press, toward the watching eyes that had begun to question the integrity of the man sitting on the bench. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her briefcase. She wasn't pulling out the USB, not yet. But the movement was intentional, a reminder that she still had something Adams didn't want exposed. A flicker of unease flashed across his face. Barely there, but noticeable enough, she placed another document in front of her, smoothing it out with her fingers before speaking again. This one was different. Not a financial record, not a testimony, but a call log, a list of names, conversations. Phone. Calls that tied key players in the corruption scheme to one number that belonged to a private encrypted phone line registered under a name that had been buried beneath layers of legal protection. But Bondi had found it, and it traced back to Adams, The moment his name was spoken aloud, the entire courtroom stiffened. The sound of pens scratching against notepads, the hushed murmurs, it was all swallowed by the weight of that revelation. Adams barely blinked, but Bondi could see the shift in his demeanor. His mask was cracking, his fingers flexed against the armrests, his breathing just a little sharper. For a man who had spent the better part of the last hour trying to project authority, he suddenly looked like someone who wanted out of this room as quickly as possible. He leaned forward, his voice slicing through the air like a blade, sharp, cold, and filled with quiet warning. Bondi had gone too far, he told her. She was grasping at straws. She was undermining the sanctity of the court with reckless accusations. But there was something new in his tone now. It wasn't just anger, it was fear. Bondi met his stare head-on, unflinching. And then she did something unexpected. She stepped back, not in retreat, but in strategy. She had given the room just enough information to plant the seed, to let the idea take root. If Adams thought shutting her down was enough to make the doubt disappear, he was sorely mistaken. Doubt didn't fade, it grew. And right now that seed of doubt was thriving in every single person in this courtroom. She turned her attention to the defense attorney, watching him shift uncomfortably. He was smart enough to realize what was happening. The case he had walked into, the one he thought was just another routine defense for an untouchable figure, was no longer in his control either, because this wasn't just about his client anymore. This was about the judge presiding over the case itself, a judge whose credibility had just been shattered in front of a room full of people who would not forget what they had just heard. Adams knew it too. He was cornered. And men like him? They made mistakes when they were cornered. Bondi was waiting for that mistake. She didn't have to wait long. Adams exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face before issuing his next move, a recess, an immediate, unprompted recess. It was the equivalent of a retreat, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding before it got worse. Bondi didn't object. She simply watched as he gathered himself, as he stood from his seat, as he attempted to leave the room with the last remnants of his authority intact. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Bondi remained still as the murmurs started, as the tension shifted from silent observation to something else entirely. People were asking questions. People were starting to wonder if the judge they had trusted was, in fact, part of the very corruption he was supposed to be overseeing. And as Adams disappeared into his chambers, Bondi allowed herself the smallest of smiles. He had just given her the greatest confirmation of all, his reaction. Because the thing about guilty men, they always ran when the walls started closing in, and Adams was running. He just didn't know yet that there was nowhere left to hide. Judge Stephen Adams had retreated into his chambers, but the courtroom was still alive, buzzing with an energy that couldn't be subdued. Pam Bondi sat still, unmoving, allowing the storm of whispers to swirl around her. She had seen the shift, the way the jurors exchanged glances, the subtle unease in the defense attorney's posture, the tightening of security near the exits. It was happening. Doubt had turned into suspicion. Suspicion was turning into belief. Adams could no longer pretend to be an impartial judge. He had revealed too much. Bondi glanced at the clock. He'd called a recess, but she knew what this really was. A delay tactic, a chance to make a call, to silence someone, to erase a trail that had already been exposed, but what he didn't know was that she had already closed off his exits. The moment Adams left the courtroom, Bondi had given a silent nod to an investigator in the gallery. The plan was already in motion. Adams wasn't the only one who knew how to maneuver behind the scenes. She had anticipated this, and now she was ready. The judge had only been gone for 15 minutes when the doors to the chamber suddenly burst open again, not by Adams, but by law enforcement. Two plainclothes federal agents entered first, their presence like a shockwave through the room. Then, another figure, James Calloway, the U.S. Attorney, overseeing government corruption cases. His arrival alone made the room shift. He wasn't here for show. He was here because something was about to happen, something permanent. The press caught. On first, cameras snapping, hands gripping notepads. The defense attorney had gone pale, his fingers twitching like he wanted to grab his briefcase and walk out before things got worse, but he didn't move. No one moved, because the moment James Calloway spoke, the entire courtroom held its breath. Judge, Adams was being investigated. Officially, the statement landed like a hammer. Calloway didn't offer details, not yet, but he didn't need to. The courtroom had already seen enough to know what this meant, and then came the next blow. Adams had been recorded. Bondi straightened. This was it. Calloway gave a single nod in her direction. It was time. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her seat, lifting the USB drive from her briefcase with the same precision as a final chess move. The defense attorney tensed, his client visibly swallowing hard. She walked toward the courtroom's audiovisual system, inserting the drive into the slot, and pressed play. The room fell silent as a grainy but clear voice filled the speakers. Judge Stephen Adams, his voice, unmistakable, caught in a conversation he never thought would see the light of day. At first, the words were clipped, formal, but then the intent unraveled. Bribery, coercion, suppression of evidence, direct orders to manipulate rulings, to block witnesses, to ensure that a case never saw a fair trial, and, worst of all, a deal. A deal made in the dead of night with a government contractor, siphoning taxpayer money into offshore accounts, just as Bondi had suspected. But now it wasn't just a theory, it was evidence, irrefutable, unforgivable. A judge, a sitting judge, selling verdicts like a broker selling stocks. The moment the recording ended, chaos erupted. Gasps, shouts, the jury looking at one another in disbelief. Reporters scrambling to record every last detail. And then the sound of footsteps, heavy, fast, from the hallway outside the courtroom. Adams. He was back, and he had heard everything. The moment he stepped through the doors, his face was twisted. In fury, but beneath it, panic. For a man who had spent his entire career towering over defendants, dictating their fates, he suddenly looked very, very small. For a split second, no one spoke. Then Calloway moved. Judge Stephen Adams, you are under investigation for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of power. The words sent a ripple through the room, but it was the sight of the agents stepping forward, the glint of handcuffs in their grip, that made the moment feel real. Adams flinched, his instinctual response kicking in. He raised a hand as if to argue, as if to command control of the courtroom once more, but there was nothing left to control. You think you can do this to me? His voice, once so powerful, cracked at the edges, desperation creeping in. I am this. Courtroom, but his words landed on deaf ears. No one was listening anymore. Bondi watched as the agent stepped forward, taking his arms, securing the cuffs with the precision of finality. He wasn't just losing his power, he was losing everything. The same gavel he had slammed to silence her, to shut down evidence, to mock her case. It sat useless on the bench behind him. Bondi took a slow breath, exhaling only when Adams was finally escorted out of the courtroom, and, just like that, the system had shifted. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back to Calloway, to the press, to the courtroom still reeling from what they had just witnessed. Because if Adams had been willing to sell verdicts, to bury cases, to conspire in government theft, then how many others had done the same? How many others had walked free because he had ensured it? This wasn't just about bringing down a corrupt judge. It was about exposing everything he had buried. Bondi straightened. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But now the battlefield had changed. With Judge Stephen Adams in custody, the weight of his power shattered in front of the very courtroom he once controlled. The case was no longer just about government corruption. It was about how deep it ran. Pam Bondi stood motionless as the doors swung shut behind Adams and the federal agents who had taken him away. The chaos still lingered in the air, the echoes of murmurs and frantic note-taking from the press, the jury shifting in their seats as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. But Bondi wasn't thinking about Adams anymore, because if he had been willing to manipulate trials, erase evidence, and protect criminals with such blatant arrogance, then it wasn't just about him. He wasn't working alone, and she wasn't about to let his downfall be the only victory today. She turned toward James Calloway, the U.S. Attorney, who was already scanning the room with the same intensity she felt. He met her gaze and gave a slight nod. He understood there was more work to do. Bondi strode back to the prosecution's table, reaching for the folder she had been waiting to open. The next target, the names tied to Adams. She had compiled it weeks ago, long before this trial, before she even knew just how far Adams was willing to go. The network was bigger than him. Government officials, businessmen, attorneys, figures who had benefited from his corruption, who had built their power on his back. She turned to the judge's bench, now empty. The symbol of his authority, the seat from which he had once dictated, who walked free and who suffered consequences, was now just another chair, lifeless, meaningless, because power was only real when people believed in it. And today the courtroom had seen what happened when someone abused it. The gavel didn't make the law. The people did. And now it was their turn to reclaim it. The new judge assigned to take over, Judge Cynthia Morales, entered the courtroom, walking to the bench with a sharp, unwavering presence, a stark contrast to Adams. She had spent years fighting corruption, not enabling it. She didn't waste a second. "The court will reconvene," she said, her voice firm. "This case is far from over." Bondi hid her satisfaction. The trial was back on track. The defense attorney, who had spent the last several hours riding on Adams's favoritism, suddenly looked like a man left stranded in the middle of the ocean with no raft. His confidence had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. Now it was just law, truth, evidence, and he had none of it on his side. Bondi motioned for her next witness, the same financial analyst that Adams had tried to silence before. Only this time, no one was stopping him. The witness took the stand, cleared his throat, and spoke freely for the first time since this case began. And, with each sentence, the picture became clearer. The offshore accounts, the laundered money, the secret meetings. The jury listened intently, now free to hear the truth without interference. Then, the final blow, a signed memo, direct authorization for the fraudulent contracts. From Adams? No. From a sitting U.S. Senator. The revelation struck the room like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just a corrupt judge. This was a system-wide operation, a political scandal that reached beyond the courtroom, beyond the state. And now it was fully exposed. The defense was crumbling. Their client, the government contractor, refused to speak, his eyes darting toward the exit like a man searching for a way out. Bondi didn't let up. She delivered the final argument, laying out the entire case with ruthless precision. By the time she was finished, there was nothing left to argue. The jury only took an hour to deliberate. When they returned, their verdict was swift, guilty. Bondi let out a slow breath as the final words sealed the fate of the defendant. But she wasn't celebrating, because this was only one piece of the puzzle. With Adams' arrest, with this verdict, the investigation was already moving up the chain. Calloway approached her as the courtroom emptied. "It's not over," he said quietly. She nodded. "We go higher," she replied. Adams' fall was just the beginning, and now those who had relied on him to protect them, to keep their crimes buried, they were next. By the time Bondi walked out of the courthouse, the press had already swarmed the entrance. The scandal had exploded beyond just legal circles. It was a national reckoning. And Bondi? She was leading it. As she stepped into the daylight, cameras flashing, microphones being shoved toward her, she only had one thought. Justice had been served today. But tomorrow, she would be back. because corruption didn't end with one arrest, and she wasn't stopping until every last piece of it was burned to the ground.